Hey, how's it going? Zach D Productions here, and I'm here for a versus video for you guys. So for this video, we'll be putting album up against album. Now, the two bands that I'm talking about here, what do they have in common? Well, they are both legendary rock bands that started out in the 70s, and both these albums here that I'm talking about released on the same year, 1982. So the two albums I am going to talk about for a brief bit here are Rockin' a Hard Place by Aerosmith and Diver Down by Van Halen. Now, as for Diver Down, I also have a card sleeve version of it because I have the Van Halen studio albums box set, which this did come with, so that's how I got this. So again, both these albums, they released in the same year, 1982, and I would say that both of them are classics for sure. I do like both albums. I just want to get that right out of the way. So let's first go ahead and talk about Rockin' a Hard Place first. Now, do I think that this is one of Aerosmith's best albums? No, I don't think so. But with saying that, I still think it's a pretty good album for what it is. But for me, I would much rather listen to their earlier albums like Rocks or Toys in the Attic or Get Your Wings. But again, Rockin' a Hard Place is still a pretty good album for what it is. But I just don't think it's one of their best. Now, of course, this was the early 80s, so this was around the time when Aerosmith started to adapt a more mainstream poppy sound. And I know that a lot of bands went in this direction when they got to the 80s. Like, I'm sure you can list a bunch of 70s bands that when they got to the 80s, they started to sell out their sound, so to speak, to sound more commercially appealing for the sound that was popular at that time. That's kind of what you get on this album, but with saying that, I still think it's pretty solid for what it is. You do have some good songs on here, like Jailbait, Lightning Strikes, Cry Me a River, and The Jig Is Up, just to name a few tracks. So, again, pretty good. Not one of their best, but pretty good, I would say. But of course, with Diver Down by Van Halen, I think that this is another really good album. Now, if you were to ask me which of Van Halen's albums would I say is the most underrated out of their whole discography, I would honestly say this one. I think that Diver Down is kind of an underrated album in Van Halen's discography. And of course, Van Halen, legendary band, they are maybe one of my favorite bands as well. And I think we can all agree that Eddie Van Halen is one of the greatest guitar players of all time. May he rest in peace. So yeah, you of course get some great riff work from Eddie on this album. Now, I know that there's people that say that this is one of Van Halen's worst albums because of all the covers that you get on here. Like, come on, this is nowhere near Van Halen's worst album. Like, there's some fans that even say that this is their worst album, which I don't get. Like, really? You would choose a different kind of Truth over this album? You would even choose Van Halen 3 over this album? OU812, you would even prefer that over this album? I mean, we can go around in circles with this, you know? Like, come on, this album is not that bad. It's definitely not as bad as some Van Halen fans make it out to be. But of course, you do have some fans that do love the album a lot, maybe even say it's one of their best. So this album is kind of in some interesting spots when we're talking about Van Halen's fan base. This is one of those albums where, you know, you either like it or you dislike it, of course, which, you know, obviously you can say that about any album ever, but you get the idea. The reception for this album can be somewhat interesting. It's interesting to hear some people's takes on this album. And one of the complaints that I have heard with this particular album is the amount of cover songs that are on the album. Personally, that has never really bothered me. I actually kind of like the covers on here. Even Oh Pretty Woman, I actually like Van Halen's version of that song. It's pretty good. You, of course, have other really good songs on here, like Where Have All the Good Times Gone, Hang 'Em High, Secrets, Dancing in the Street, and Little Guitars, another one of the highlights on the album. So yeah, overall, I'd say it's good. It's a really good Van Halen album. I don't think it's their best. Now, for me, my favorite Van Halen album, and the album I would say is their best, is probably either the self-titled debut or Fair Warning. Fair Warning is my personal favorite, probably, but the debut would be very close in second, and those two I would say are their best albums. But Diver Down, it's still a pretty strong album for sure, and still worth checking out if you haven't listened to it. Now, of the two albums here, Aerosmith, Rock in a Hard Place, or Van Halen, Diver Down, which is the winner of this video? Which album do I prefer? For me, I gotta go with Diver Down, which may not come off as a surprise to some, but I just thoroughly enjoy this album more than Rock in a Hard Place. But still, Rock in a Hard Place, it's still a pretty good album. But again, I just find more replay value with Diver Down, and there you go. So Diver Down is the winner of this video. So let me know what you think. Are you a fan of these bands? Aerosmith, Van Halen? Which album do you prefer? Feel free to let me know that. Do you like both albums? Let me know. So with that said, thanks for watching. Have a good one.